The monk had risen before dawn as he always did. A blanket of mist hung over the North Sea while the first bells echoed through the monastery at Lindisfarne. Candles flickered beside unfinished manuscripts. Ink dried slowly on parchment. In the chapel, familiar prayers drifted through the darkness, joining countless others spoken in the same place across generations. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual. For the monks, life followed a rhythm that felt permanent. The sea marked the edge of their world. The monastery offered order, purpose, and protection. Beyond its walls lay uncertainty, but within them there was routine, faith, and the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Then ships emerged from the fog. At first, they appeared as distant shadows moving across the water. Some of the brothers watched from the shoreline, uncertain whether the newcomers were merchants, travelers, or sailors seeking shelter. No one had reason to imagine that the vessels approaching them would soon become part of history. The realization came too late. Warriors poured ashore carrying axes and spears. Doors splintered beneath heavy blows. Buildings caught fire. Men who had spent their lives copying sacred texts were cut down beside the altars, where they had prayed only moments earlier. Precious vessels vanished into foreign hands, while survivors fled into the surrounding countryside, carrying stories they scarcely understood themselves. The year was 793. The attack on Lindisfarne would become one of the most infamous events of the early medieval world. News of the raid spread rapidly across Christian Europe. Monasteries copied accounts of the violence. Bishops spoke of divine punishment. In distant kingdoms, people who had never seen a Viking began to fear them. To many, the destruction felt like more than an isolated act of violence. It felt like evidence that something fundamental had changed. The old certainties of the Christian world suddenly seemed less secure than they had the day before. Yet nothing about that morning had emerged from nowhere. Long before the sails appeared on the horizon, forces had been gathering along the cold northern edge of Europe. Across the rugged coastlines of Scandinavia, a society was taking shape that would redraw trade routes, challenge kingdoms, establish cities, and carry its people farther than almost anyone thought possible. The story of the Vikings did not begin with conquest. It began with survival. If you enjoy learning about history, subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. In the comments, let me know where you're listening from. I would love to hear from you. Scandinavia was a land shaped by distance, climate, and uncertainty. Mountain ranges divided communities from one another. Vast forests covered enormous stretches of territory. Winters arrived early and lingered long. The growing season was short, and even successful harvests could not guarantee security. A single year of poor weather might bring hardship. Several in succession could threaten survival itself. For those living along the northern coasts, life demanded resilience. Families relied on fishing, livestock, and small pockets of arable land squeezed between mountains and sea. The environment offered opportunities, but it rarely offered comfort. Every season carried risks, and every generation learned to adapt to forces beyond its control. Yet these harsh conditions did not produce isolation. By the 8th century, Scandinavian society had become more connected and sophisticated than many later stereotypes would suggest. Farmers cultivated their fields. Craftsmen produced iron tools and weapons of remarkable quality. Merchants traveled rivers and coastal routes, carrying amber, furs, walrus ivory, and enslaved people to distant markets. Local chieftains competed for influence, while public assemblies, known as things settled disputes, enforced laws and maintained a measure of social order. It was a functioning world, but it was also a world balanced upon pressure. A family's future depended not only on weather and harvests, but on alliances, reputation, and the decisions of powerful men. Honor carried immense value. A public insult could ignite feuds lasting years. Wealth brought influence, and influence attracted rivals. Stability existed, yet beneath it lay constant competition. Even death reflected these values. When prominent men died, entire communities gathered to witness their passage into the next life. Weapons, treasured possessions, and symbols of status accompanied the dead. Along the shoreline, smoke drifted into the sky, while stories of courage and achievement passed from one generation to the next. Memory itself became a form of immortality. To outsiders, such rituals could seem strange or unsettling. To the Norse, they reflected a simple truth. A remembered life endured, while a forgotten one disappeared. As the 8th century progressed, deeper pressures began to emerge. Populations appear to have increased in parts of Scandinavia. More families competed for limited land. Ambitious young men sought opportunities unavailable within their communities. Chieftains required loyal followers, and followers expected rewards in return. The old balance was becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, another transformation was quietly unfolding along the northern coasts. Shipbuilders were perfecting one of the most important technologies of the medieval world. The Viking longship was not merely a vessel. It was a solution to geography itself. Light enough to be dragged across land, shallow enough to navigate rivers, and strong enough to survive the open ocean. It allowed Scandinavians to move in ways their neighbors could not. Longships could travel where larger vessels struggled. They could appear unexpectedly, strike quickly, and vanish before defenders organized a response. Distance began to lose its power. The sea, which had once divided communities, became a road, and beyond that road lay opportunity. To the south, Europe was undergoing its own transformation. Kingdoms expanded their authority. Trade networks connected distant regions. Churches accumulated wealth. Monasteries gathered silver, gold, manuscripts, and sacred treasures over generations. Many of these institutions stood along exposed coastlines. From a Scandinavian perspective, enormous wealth often appeared concentrated in places protected more by faith than by soldiers. Yet greed alone cannot explain what followed. The Viking Age emerged from a combination of necessity, ambition, competition, and innovation. Young warriors sought status. Chieftains sought influence. Merchants sought markets. Families sought land. Explorers sought horizons that earlier generations had never imagined crossing. A society accustomed to confronting limits suddenly possessed the means to move beyond them. The consequences would reshape Europe. At first, the expeditions remained relatively small. A monastery here, a coastal settlement there. The attacks were swift and difficult to predict. Local rulers struggled to respond because they were confronting a threat unlike any they had faced before. Their defenses had been designed for enemies approaching over land. These newcomers arrived from the sea. Imagine living along the coast of Northumbria, Ireland, or Francia during these years. The day begins like countless others. Fishermen prepare their boats. Farmers work their fields. Merchants open their stalls. Children move between houses while church bells mark the passing hours. Then a lookout spots unfamiliar sails. Within moments, uncertainty spreads through the settlement. No one knows who is approaching or what they want. There may be time to prepare. There may not. That uncertainty became a weapon in its own right. Stories spread faster than the ships themselves. Villages heard rumors of monasteries reduced to ash. Kings received reports of attacks hundreds of miles apart. Fear traveled across Europe long before most people ever encountered a Viking face-to-face. And fear has a way of magnifying power. With each successful voyage, wealth flowed back into Scandinavia. Silver increased a chieftain's influence. Influence attracted followers. Followers enabled larger expeditions. Success created momentum, and momentum encouraged further expansion. Few people living through these years realized they were witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would alter the course of medieval history. What began as scattered raids would soon evolve into something far larger. The ships appearing on Europe's shores carried more than warriors. They carried merchants, settlers, explorers, and ambitions vast enough to cross oceans. Beyond the horizon, a new world was already beginning to take shape. The transformation did not happen all at once. For many years, the rulers of Europe continued to view the Vikings primarily as raiders, dangerous and unpredictable, but temporary. They imagined men arriving to seize wealth before disappearing back across the sea. What they failed to understand was that the nature of the movement itself was changing. The ships crossing the North Sea were no longer carrying only warriors. Increasingly, they carried families. Across Ireland, Britain, and the river systems of Eastern Europe, temporary camps evolved into permanent settlements. Wooden fortifications expanded into thriving towns. Seasonal expeditions became communities. What had begun as movement was becoming migration, and migration was becoming civilization. One of the clearest examples emerged in Ireland. The Vikings had first arrived as raiders, targeting monasteries and coastal settlements. Yet over time they established fortified bases that developed into important centers of trade. Among them was Dublin, which began as a simple Norse encampment before growing into one of the most significant commercial hubs in the region. Ships arrived carrying silver, timber, furs, wine, textiles, and people from distant lands. Markets expanded, wealth accumulated, new opportunities emerged. The men who had once appeared as foreign invaders were becoming part of the landscape itself. Farther east, Scandinavian adventurers followed a different path. Rather than crossing open seas, they traveled along vast river systems stretching deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine. Their ships moved between the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea, connecting northern Europe to some of the wealthiest regions of the medieval world. A trader standing in a Scandinavian settlement might handle silver minted thousands of miles away in Baghdad. The coin passes from one hand to another, carrying evidence of connections that few people fully understood. Yet those small pieces of silver reveal something remarkable. The Viking world was becoming part of an international network that linked distant civilizations together. The age of isolated communities was beginning to fade. A larger world was emerging. But growth brought new pressures. Success created wealth, and wealth created ambition. Ambition intensified rivalries. Chieftains competed for followers. Followers expected rewards. Prestige depended upon achievement, and achievement often required risk. The forces that had driven Viking expansion were becoming stronger with every passing generation. Nowhere would those pressures become more visible than in England. For decades, Viking raids had tested the defenses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Coastal communities had learned to fear unfamiliar sails on the horizon. Yet the events that began in 1865 represented something entirely different. That year, a force remembered by later chroniclers as the Great Heathen Army landed in England. This was not a raiding party seeking a season of plunder. It was an army. Among its leaders was a figure whose reputation would echo through legend, Ivar the Boneless. Whether every story attached to his name was true scarcely mattered. His reputation alone became a weapon. Across England, tales of Viking commanders spread fear long before their armies appeared. Unlike earlier raiders, these men had come to stay. They intended to conquer territory, claim wealth, and reshape the political landscape of Britain. The impact was profound. Northumbria fractured under pressure. East Anglia fell. Mercia weakened. Kingdoms that had existed for generations suddenly faced threats unlike anything they had experienced before. Imagine standing on the walls of an English town during those years. Messengers arrive carrying grim news. Villages have been burned. monasteries looted. Entire regions have fallen under Scandinavian control. Then one morning, sails appear on the horizon. Not a handful, hundreds. The realization settles slowly. These men are not leaving when winter comes. They intend to remain. For many communities, that understanding transformed fear into something deeper. It was no longer a question of surviving a raid. It was a question of whether the world they knew would continue to exist at all. Yet even during this period of conflict, another story was unfolding beneath the surface. Cultures were beginning to merge. Scandinavian settlers married local populations. Languages mixed. Trade expanded. Legal traditions influenced one another. Daily life demanded cooperation even where politics encouraged division. History often remembers battles because they are dramatic. People, however, spend most of their lives adapting. This process became especially visible within the Danelaw, a vast area of England governed under Scandinavian influence. Here, Norse customs and Anglo-Saxon traditions interacted every day. Markets thrived. Farms produced food. Families raised children whose identities reflected multiple worlds at once. The line between conqueror and conquered became increasingly difficult to define. While England grappled with these changes, another chapter of the Viking story was unfolding far beyond Europe's familiar horizons, the North Atlantic. To modern observers, the waters between Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and North America remain intimidating. In the Viking Age, they represented one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Storms emerged without warning. Navigation depended upon experience, memory, and instinct. A single mistake could prove fatal. Yet the horizon continued to pull people westward. Around 870, settlers began establishing communities in Iceland. The journey demanded extraordinary courage. Families disappeared beyond the edge of the known world, knowing they might never return. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a sailor scans empty water in every direction. Days pass, then weeks. Food supplies shrink. Freezing spray covers the deck. Storm clouds gather. The sea offers no promise that land exists ahead. Still they sail. When Iceland finally emerged from the ocean mist, it represented more than a destination. It represented possibility. And for a society increasingly defined by movement, possibility was impossible to resist. Possibility, however, came with a cost. The farther the Viking world expanded, the more difficult it became to hold together. Every new settlement required resources. Every distant colony depended upon fragile lines of communication. Every successful leader attracted rivals eager to challenge his authority. Expansion had brought wealth, influence, and opportunity. It had also created new vulnerabilities. By the late 10th century, the societies of Scandinavia were changing in ways that would have been difficult for the raiders of Lindisfarne to imagine. Regional chieftains who had once governed scattered territories faced increasing pressure from ambitious rulers, determined to unite larger kingdoms. Under centralized authority, the age of independent war leaders was beginning to fade. Across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, kings sought greater control over taxation, trade, and law. Power that had once been distributed among local elites gradually flowed toward royal courts. The qualities required to build a kingdom were not always the same as those required to lead a raid. A successful expedition could win glory. Governance required stability. As political structures evolved, another transformation moved through the Viking world with equal force. Christianity. For generations, Norse society had been shaped by stories of Odin, Thor, Freyja, and the many gods who populated its mythology. Their tales explained courage, sacrifice, loyalty, and fate. They offered meaning in a world where survival often depended upon forces beyond human control. Yet no society remains untouched by prolonged contact with its neighbors. As trade expanded and Scandinavian rulers forged closer relationships with Christian Europe, a new faith traveled northward. Missionaries arrived in growing numbers. Churches appeared in settlements where pagan shrines had once stood. Kings discovered that conversion could strengthen alliances and reinforce their authority. The process unfolded gradually. Old customs endured. Traditional beliefs persisted. Entire generations lived between two worlds, embracing elements of both. But the direction of change was clear. The religion that Viking raiders had once encountered abroad was becoming the religion of their descendants. In many ways, the transformation symbolized a larger shift. Scandinavia was no longer a distant frontier on the edge of Europe. It was becoming part of the broader European world. Ironically, the success of Viking expansion had helped make that change possible. Trade reduced reliance on raiding. Established settlements offered opportunities closer to home. Stronger governments limited the independence of local warlords who had once organized expeditions across the sea. The forces that had driven centuries of expansion gradually began to weaken. Yet Scandinavian influence remained immense. Their descendants ruled territories far beyond their homelands. Their merchants continued to move through international trade networks. Their warriors served in foreign courts and distant armies. Among the most famous were the Norsemen who joined the Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Imagine a young man departing a small settlement beside a Norwegian fjord. Years later, he stands beneath the vast golden domes of one of the richest cities on earth. Around him stretch crowded markets, towering walls, and languages he has never heard before. Within a few centuries, a society once considered remote had become connected to nearly every major center of power in Europe. Yet one final chapter remained, and it would unfold in England. The same land that had witnessed some of the earliest Viking raids would also witness the symbolic end of the Viking Age. In 1066, a formidable Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada launched an invasion of England. Few figures embodied the older Viking tradition more completely. He had fought as a mercenary, commanded armies across Europe, served in the Byzantine Empire, and built a reputation that inspired both admiration and fear. His campaign represented more than a struggle for a throne. It represented the last great expression of the Viking warrior age. For a brief moment, success seemed within reach. Then came Stamford Bridge. On September 25, 1066, English forces led by Harold Godwinson confronted Hardrada's army. The battle was fierce and decisive. Hardrada was killed. Much of his force was destroyed. The invasion collapsed. Later generations would remember Stamford Bridge as the end of the Viking Age. History is rarely so neat. No single battle can erase a people. No single date can end a civilization. Yet symbols matter, and Stamford Bridge became one of the most powerful symbols in medieval history. The era that had begun with longships emerging from the mist at Lindisfarne had reached its final chapter, but endings in history are often transformations in disguise. The Vikings did not disappear. Their descendants ruled kingdoms. Their settlements became cities. Their trade routes continued to shape commerce. Their language left lasting marks upon English and other European tongues. Their legal traditions influenced institutions. Their explorations expanded humanity's understanding of the world. Even today, traces of the Viking Age remain visible across Europe and beyond. Yet perhaps the most important legacy lies not in artifacts, place names, or ancient ruins. It lies in the story itself. A society confronting environmental limits, political competition, and economic pressure developed the tools to overcome distance. Those successes generated expansion. Expansion generated wealth. Wealth generated power. And power created new forms of fragility. The pattern feels familiar because it is. Every generation believes its world is more permanent than it truly is. Every civilization imagines that the system surrounding it will endure indefinitely. History repeatedly suggests otherwise. The monks at Lindisfarne could not have imagined that the strangers arriving from the sea would help reshape kingdoms, establish cities, and alter the course of European history. Nor could the Vikings themselves fully understand the consequences of their ambitions. History rarely unfolds according to anyone's design. It emerges from countless individuals responding to opportunity, pressure, fear, and hope, each believing they are acting within the limits of their own time. The Viking Age transformed Europe because a society standing at the edge of possibility chose to push beyond the horizon, and in doing so, it changed the world. I am watching the past so we can understand the present, and together we keep history alive.